Hello, Mr. Grace. This is the first out of the five videos that I'm trying to get Ollie's on because I feel that I understand the article very well now and I'm going to explain it in depth. So, the article I will be speaking about now is fantasy football, illegal gambling, or legal game skill. So, pretty much, this article is about a court case which is called Humphrey v. Viacom, and it's about this man who claimed that three other men were using fantasy sports as an illegal form of gambling. So this court case was trying to determine um, if fantasy sports was an illegal way of gambling or if it was a legal game of skill. And I've done other articles that have proven that fantasy football and fantasy sports is requires skill. So there's much evidence for that, and this article is another way of proving it. So there's three questions or three statements, pretty much three main reasons that the literature review spoke about that I wrote down. One of them was that traditional rationales for outlying gambling do not apply to fantasy sports. So the traditional reasons of why gambling is gambling doesn't really apply to fantasy sports. Another one is saying that the congressional legislation evidence supports fantasy sports. So the government supports fantasy sports and they want it to happen. And another one is that an adverse decision would damage a billion-dollar industry, pretty much saying that if a decision was to made saying that it wasn't a legal form of gambling, it would be killing a billion-dollar business that would make a lot of people mad. So now when it came to the methods of this experiment or court case, I guess you would call it, in this article, there was the main question, which was answering, is fantasy football a legal game of skill? And the court case did this by trying to see the factors of how fantasy sports or fantasy football specifically requires skill. And one thing that the plaintiff stated was that there's factors that are out of hand in fantasy sports, and it's like betting on teams. So when the court researched into this, their basic like their final answer was that fantasy does require it's a legal game of skill and it does require skill. So the court case was dropped and it never went through because the man wasn't right, and the court proved that it was a legal game of skill. And pretty much they said that there's factors that make it intellectual. Like, yes, it can be luck, but there's things that determine, like, you could see the weather of the game, or they were saying how you could see if a player is hurt or not. So you really have to research into these things. It's not just placing it into the lineup. Also, players can play fantasy football whenever they want, 24/7. Um, Also, fantasy. I wrote down that a bill has been passed acknowledging the difference in fantasy sports and gambling, which they showed how this article led to a bill being passed in 2006, showing that fantasy sports is a legal game of skill. And skill and chance, it's a mix, but it's both required. And those are kind of the many reasons and reasons that they showed in the results of why fantasy football is a legal game of skill.